Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session on international market standards and quantifying carbon and other ecosystem benefits in peatlands. My name is Chris Field. I'm a lecturer and researcher at Met Uni, and I'm also a work package leader on the Interreg Northwest Europe Care Peat project. There's a number of EU-funded projects ongoing in the UK at the moment, with ongoing around Europe with UK delivery partners on the land and in knowledge partners. So we thought it would be a really good idea to bring in that international dimension to the conference today. It fits really well with the sessions we've had this morning about the peatland code and peatland financing, and also with the wet agriculture session we had yesterday afternoon as well. So we've got 4 great talks lined up. First up, we're going to have Susanne Abel from the Greifswald Mire Centre, who's going to talk about the sorts of job profiles and remuneration we can expect in Paludiculture. So that sits really well with some of the questions we had yesterday in the wet agriculture session. And then we've got Fritz from Radboud University in the Netherlands, who's going to share their experiences on their carbon credit scheme and also payments for ecosystem services, followed by Jasper van Belle from Van Hol Larenstein University, also in the Netherlands, who's been applying the GEST model, so greenhouse gas emission site types, which is where they use vegetation types as a proxy to calculate carbon credits. So there was some discussion this morning in the peatland code session about that model, so it'll be really useful to hear a little bit more about it. And then finally, we're going to have Laurent from BRGM, the French Geological Survey, who's we're working with within the Care Peat project, who's also modelling gas fluxes at the landscape scale. So there's lots of stuff going on in the UK and around Europe, and it's really nice to try and think about how we can bring the different sort of research models together in the future. So enjoy the session. Please do submit your questions and questions to the little question tab, and we'll join you again in about 40 minutes time when we'll have a live Q&A session with the presenters. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Susanne Abel. I'm from the Greifswald Mire Center in Germany, and we are a science policy practice interface for all peatland related questions. And I want to talk about carbon farming on peatlands, remuneration and new job profiles with Paludiculture. Peatlands are long-term carbon stocks, you all know that. While covering only 3% of the land area, they store twice the carbon stock of the world's forest biomass. They are worldwide distributed, and all countries of Europe have peatlands, but the majority is drained. In Germany, 98% are drained, mostly for agriculture. Drainage-based agriculture, such as dairy farming on peatlands, is widespread across the EU. And also the produced goods from these sites are responsible for high emissions during their production. The emissions of milk and cheese are more than 5 times higher than from mineral soil. Therefore, 1 liter of milk from drained peatlands is equivalent with 2.4 liters of burning petrol. There are also large areas used as cropland with an even higher emission factor. This cultivation is responsible for more carbon loss through soil degradation than carbon that is in the biomass of the produced potatoes. The drained organic soil emit around 5% of the EU's annual greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural use peatlands have the largest share of that, but from a small area. In reverse, this means on a very small area, high emission reduction is possible. Rewetting of peatlands results in almost full stop for CO2 emissions from oxidation of organic carbon and the conservation of the remaining carbon in the peat. Avoided emissions are most suitable for carbon farming, as they offer immediate, quantifiable and significant climate mitigation impacts. To achieve that, we need a paradigm shift for peatland use. Alternative income options need to be developed to incentivize the farmers through paludiculture and rewarding of the emission reduction, with public payments or appropriate credit schemes. Paludiculture is the productive use of wet peatlands, where wetland crops are cultivated and new value chains for the bioeconomy are established. In order for this to be implemented, we need an adjustment of the agricultural policy framework, because many paludicultures currently are not eligible for cap payments. Currently, the biomass from wet peatlands is not highly valued, but there are promising new value chains for the bioeconomy. For example, the biomass can be used as building and insulation material. The fibers can be used for paper, packaging, and biodegradable dishes. On the right side, for example, the samples are made from paludi biomass, from sedges, from typher, and from reed. The biomass can be used for fuel and for growing media for horticulture, helping phasing out the peat use. The products of paludiculture made of paludi biomass can be climate friendly in three ways. First, by climate smart agriculture, by the avoidance of the emissions from the peatland side. Second, from renewables replacing fossils. And third, they can also be a long-term carbon storage when they used, for example, as building material. When the emission reduction is reflected in the product, it could be on the one hand an insetting option for companies using, for example, packaging materials, but also the price for the biomass and the profit for the farmer is higher and would be an important incentive for paludiculture. The current rewarding options for rewetting in the EU are, for example, agri-environmental climate schemes. For example, low-intensity grasslands schemes. But these ones mostly are not addressing the water level. There is one AES moorschonende Stauhaltung in the federal state Brandenburg in Germany, where a fixed weir is used as an orientation for a water level rise, but also this scheme is not result based. We need an evaluation of the real emission reduction. For farmers on peatlands, we need a new job profile to identify themselves as peatland carbon farmers. In German, we call it more Klimawirt, and we are developing that together with Landcare Germany. So this would be a farmer who provides climate protection services in the management of agricultural use peatlands. And the climate protection is achieved by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions by raising the water levels or the maintenance of high water levels. And examples of such managements are wet meadow, wet pasture management, cultivation of paludiculture crops, or a complete retirement at high water levels. One existing example is the heating plant in northeast Germany, where biomass from a rewetted fen, so sedges, wet meadows, are used from 400 hectares, and the heating plant feeds in a local heat network of the city of Malchin. And here we have the emission reduction via avoidance around 10 tons CO2 equivalents per hectare and year, and substitution of gas. And at the moment, the heating plant works and competes with fossil fuels without the rewarding of the climate benefits by climate smart agriculture. Another example is the peat moss cultivation. On our 17-hectare pilot site in northwest Germany on a former bog grassland. Here we produce peat moss to substitute peat in horticulture, and we have an emission reduction via avoidance from the site, around 15 ton CO2 equivalents per hectare and year, and another 15 ton CO2 equivalents per hectare and year for the replacement of the fossil peat. For the implementation of paludiculture, there are lots of challenges for the farmer. It is a total break with their traditions and means in most cases a total conversion of the farm orientation. We lack of experience with paludiculture, and we lack of demonstration farms. The value chains are missing for paludi biomass. We have, from several examples, we know conflicts with nature conservation. We have conflicts with the current CAP that is not supporting paludiculture, and also lots of practical challenges, for example, area access, because of fragmented ownership structures, impacts on neighboring sites, especially when you want to re-wet only a small wet island in a drained area. So we have to think in hydrological units. We need to use land consolidation and also regional cooperation. Paludiculture research is necessary and is carried out in several pilots from several institutions about, for example, management practices on a large scale, greenhouse gas emission effects, and area-based monitoring and evaluation to develop proxies for MRB. Paludiculture and carbon farming, or as carbon farming, is a win-win option for various sectors of the society. For agriculture, it means new income opportunities on marginal organic soils, soil protection, a better social image, and climate adaptation. For the society, it means securing and creating employment in rural areas, regional creation and tourism, identity. For the economy, it means substitution of fossil resources by renewable biomass. And for the environment, it means climate, water, and biodiversity protections with comparatively low costs. And yeah, that's why peatlands must be wet now. And if you want to know more about our work, please visit our websites. Thank you for your attention.
Try to get back.
So just a minor technical fault. We did have Christian's screen share up for the whole of the last video, but it's just disappeared at the moment as we cut to him. So just bear with us for one second or so. Please do keep your questions coming in. We've got a couple in so far, but yeah, we're really keen to have a number more for the discussion if we can.
Thanks for your patience, everyone. I would like to tell you about the bumpy roads of carbon credit schemes in the Dutch peatlands. And so maybe losing the screen wasn't that, was a bit fitting the theme. Actually, before coming to the Netherlands and the peatlands, there used to be around 2 million hectares, of which there's near 350,000 left. I've been working in peatlands all over the world, pretty much. I started my career in New Zealand and went to Tierra del Fuego in South America, and this is also a beautiful place here in Siberia. And this peatland work involves a lot of traveling, and transportation wasn't that easy. So peatlands mean also wet stuff, gumboots. And for some of our questions, we really had to go to the uttermost end of the world and get in touch with the elements to focus on processes to do research that helps us to understand what's going on in peatlands. And so living peatlands in particular and restoring destroyed peatlands has ever fancied my interest since. And the main cause of peatland change, yeah, as far as I can see, and the Netherlands are very good in that, is drainage. So drainage cause very high greenhouse gas emissions, and they inflict a lot of land use changes and fire and things like that. Yeah, as I said, the Dutchies are quite good in draining the entire country, and they better are, because at least half of the country is already below sea level. And but on the same hand, there's also growing interest in carbon projects and in carbon work. And interestingly, there's in the north of the Netherlands, there's already the first carbon credit scheme established in peatlands, and there's another 3 sites where we assess the greenhouse gas reduction potential, and that work is published. And on the opposite, in the west of the Netherlands, there's work in progress for quite some time. They started already in 2012, but nothing really tangible came out of that. And what did came out is that we have a good overview about deep drainage and their relation to high CO2 emissions. And there's a national program now increasing drainage in the Netherlands. So they're talking about thousands of kilometers of extra drainage, on average 2 kilometers per hectare extra drainage. So that's every 4 meters, some of these tiles. So that's quite some development on the other hand. So we have to watch that carefully in the future. And how are these carbon credit projects run? First, you need some land, you look for people that would like to get involved, and then we establish a baseline. And that baseline is, as I will show you in a minute, is mainly focused on land use and water levels. And here's an intensive grassland that is fertilized and cut 5 times a year. And then you get a project scenario, and that usually means rewetting. So groundwater levels go up. And in the recent, in the first carbon credit methodology that's there in the Netherlands, valuta for veen it's called, there's also a direct link to reduce land use intensity, as you can already see on the picture. So that's a quite different vegetation you get. How do you get there? Higher ditch water levels, ideally up to the surface. So you can see that here's our dip well. The brownish color indicates that that's sometimes flooded right up to the surface, and here you have some sort of wear, and yeah, so the water goes up, and there's also the opportunity for furrow irrigation. So really tiny ditches. You can I don't know if you guys see my pointer, but there's some of these lines here in the back where the water can infiltrate. Why is that important for the water to get infiltrated into the land? The current methodology falls back onto a publication that my colleagues and I have presented a few years ago that was inspired by John Kaumberg's work. So what we did basically was piling up Dutch emission studies that were reported to the IPCC or to the local government, and what we only want to know is the difference between 2 water level scenarios. Our baseline, which probably lies somewhere here around the 50, and a scenario where we have at least a 30 centimeters increase, so from 50 to 20, for example, to be on the safe side. And the conversion factor then basically is 5 tons per 10 centimeter increase. Water level is not only a proxy for all sorts of greenhouse gas related processes, but also for peat forming vegetation. So that is one way to look at it, and land use intensity. If the land is wet enough, then you can't go there with a big tractor and many of cows. So that's the methodology. So you start off, let's say somewhere in your baseline around 50, you have a project scenario at 20, then you calculate the difference. In that case would be 3 times 5, so 15 tons, and then a bit of a safety margin, leaving something like 10 tons per hectare per year. We got a little bit of money to actually extend this methodology, which is in the Netherlands now is monitored just by groundwater level monitoring. So we got some funding for greenhouse gas emission measurements, and our colleague Rainer Nauter, which is a former student of Jasper, who will talk next to me. So he's doing now, day in, day out, a lot of work in the field, measuring in these different situations, also greenhouse gas emissions, so far limited to CO2. And the government really asked to keep it low cost, and that's what we did. So you see quite some basic equipment. This is another field site. It is not our carbon credit site, but also here there's just more natural vegetation involved. And when installing this stuff, to keep it low cost, we need a lot of men and women power, which we get also from students and from sometimes even friends from Rainer helping. But also the water board, the water authority helping, and financing, as I said, comes from STOA, which is Association of Water Boards and Provinces. So they gave us a bit of extra money to check the current methodology. And we start with then in mid of June this year, actually, despite of Corona pericles. And what I would like to show you is let's say here, the baseline, the 2 sides. The orange one is the still drain side, and this is the project side. So you see a drastic increase of groundwater levels during night fluxes, which is here in the lower. We see in the beginning, we also see some large differences. This is the black dots. Then that flattens off in the rest of the season. However, during the day, we see much higher CO2 uptake by our project plots by the carbon credit. So at the end, we expect quite some difference in the carbon balance. So this is how it looks like in the field. Not too fancy, but it does what it needs to do. Then I would like to show you a few more sites. Here's more to the east, also in the north, where we work with carbon credit schemes, use the more futures methodology, which Jasper also will talk more about in detail. And if you do that for an existing nature reserve, and our PhD student Belle, he did that in the Drentse A, which is a 2100 hectare reserve, and with action taken on 600 hectares, we see differences in CO2 and methane. And if you just sum that all up, you end up with 3 tons CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. And that sounds very little in the first place. However, it's 2,000 hectares or a bit more. So the local authorities, they just lose every year 150 to 300,000 euros of potential CO2 certificates. So that's quite sad for them. Another example here from the south in the Netherlands, in Brabant, where maybe some of you have been during your project, with some from Carbon Connects are involved. And here we did something similar, also based on vegetation and water level data. We made an estimation of greenhouse gas reduction. And again, we saw substantial differences, up to 2,000 tons of CO2 equivalents per year for the entire area. And that again is not used. It's just, it's a bit left behind. If you ask the people why, it's too much hassle for them. They get the money from the government anyway. So last but not least, ecosystem services, because that also has to do with money. We've done quite some work on that, and also colleagues from all over Europe. And I keep that short because of time. Yeah, the rewetted, restored sites, they can add to biomass production. They're very important for reducing nitrogen deposition on the site, simply because livestock needs to go somewhere else. The water treatment effect, and both are, in terms of money, are quite a big thing in the Netherlands. We have a €1 billion nitrogen crisis still going on despite Corona. This on phosphorus availability, this work still ongoing. And as I said, there's also the potential of nutrient removal by harvesting, which is another stream of income. And water retention, again, that's something the Dutch are better good in because they need it for the future, and a cooling effect. And if you all sum this up, all these factors, and put shadow prices that the Dutch government has, and if you ask for also some of the banks has done, you see that drained peatlands, they usually end up with a negative number of ecosystem services. A lot of this has to do with nitrogen and partly also CO2 in these worst case. And if you restore the land, put sphagnum on it, you get in a positive number. Again, this money still hasn't been monetized. If you do it for different vegetations, you get a more fine scale input. And I would like to finish with, we scientists, we like to keep measuring, and we will keep on measuring, but we ask ourselves who starts implementing. And I hope that I hear some answers from you guys in the chat, and we'll keep on with our peat cooperation. And luckily, we are not alone. Thank you. Chris will take over.
Okay, thanks very much, Christian, for that talk. Just bear with us a second while we set up Jasper's talk. Really interesting to hear about the experiences in the Netherlands, particularly around agriculture. And I'm sort of wondering if, with much of the country technically underwater or under the sea level, if we start rewetting the peatlands, if we'll manage to raise those land levels as well. And some interesting chat about the Dutch also being blamed for draining the fens in East Anglia as well. So good to see that we are cooperating internationally as well. But thank you, and over to Jasper.
Yeah. Well, hello to you all. I'm Jasper van Belle. I'll be talking about something that we've been developing within the Carbon Connects project, which Christian is actually a part of as well. And what we've been trying to do is to build tools to help with the implementation of getting people to actually implement all these ecosystem services. And now I'm just trying to find the right, that's the right button. So these are all the parties involved. It's an international project, so there's quite a few different partners. Basically, I'll be giving you a short overview now of the site emissions tool that we have been building and which is available for you to use right now. And I'll spend a few words on other ecosystem service quantification tools that we are currently working upon. So going to the site emissions tool, what the objective of the site emissions tool was to build a system that is useful, credible enough, so founded in scientific knowledge, but be simple enough to use for a non-specialist user to actually be applied for peatland rewetting projects. So the ultimate goal was to calculate carbon credits resulting from peat rewetting projects, and it builds upon the GEST database that has been referred to previously. And it takes a scenario approach, just as what Christian touched upon. So what it does, it calculates, or it estimates, I should really say. It's not a very fancy model. It's more a model made to make things, to give a comprehensive overview of the ecosystem services involved with peatland rewetting. So it estimates CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide fluxes and translates these to CO2 equivalents. and it addresses both fluxes from the land itself, for which we use the GEST database, and from management, which is based upon IPCC standard calculations. Biomass, which is harvested, can be used to also calculate carbon credits if it's stored for long enough. I'll now give you a few screenshots of the input screen. So this is what it does. It calculates carbon fluxes from land, so that the user is asked to input the median groundwater level in summer and for the baseline and the rewetting scenario. And this limits the amount of GEST types, so vegetation types, if you will, that the user can choose from, but the user has to choose the best fitting vegetation type. The user also has to put in the peat depth and the type of peat, because the system uses this to calculate the carbon stock that's available in the soil. Because if you look at carbon crediting, you cannot claim more credits than are actually available in your soil. So this limits the amount of carbon credits that can be claimed, and has an effect on the timeline development, so the development over time. To also include nitrous oxide fluxes, because these are not, contrary to the CO2 and methane fluxes, the nitrous oxide fluxes are not included in the GEST database. So we used IPCC Tier 1 calculations to calculate these from fertilization, manure application, grazing animals, crop residues being left on the fields. It's really just the Tier 1 calculations being carried out for the user behind the screens. Then, if you rewet, you also need to consider what this does to your fuel use for activity, so for land management, for instance, for pumps, but also if you look at the mowing equipment, it might change from very large scale tractors, which might actually use less fuel per hectare than the more small scale wetland tracks that are available. Or it might not, but in any case, the user is asked to supply the amount of kilowatt hours of electricity use and the diesel consumption used for land management. And this is also well transformed into CO2 equivalents, or CO2 actually. Then the product use, you might consider using the biomass harvested to replace fossil fuels, or to replace fossil-based building materials by bio-based building materials. The picture that you see here is on the left is a very, at least for Dutch situation, very standard row of houses. And on the right is the bio-based pavilion, which was made entirely of wood and taifa and rice straw and fungi. And this was presented on the Dutch Design Week last year. So it is almost possible to build your house entirely bio-based. And if you do this, you are actually storing the carbon contained in the biomass for a long time. So you can count this as carbon storage. So this is basically what we've been trying to build. We've been trying to help people wanting to rewet to estimate the carbon effects of these rewetting projects. If you want to play around with this yourself, you can. The Carbon Connect's website, the link is shown here. And if you then look for the tab that says the site emissions tool, there you can calculate, or you can download the site emissions tool. And you can also download some documentation describing how it works, how to use it, and all the information that we're building upon. So a few words on other stuff that we're still working on. The site emissions tool is pretty much done now, or at least for this phase. There's always room for improvement, of course. Other things we're looking at is what we've been calling blue credits, and it's This falls apart into two categories. One is the water quality improvement. So that's basically nutrient scrubbing from surface water, and the other is water quantity. So keeping the land wet and storing up water for dry times. This is, well, the current state is for the water quality tool, the nutrient reduction tool, I've been calling this. And basically we separate, we try to do the same thing here as with the site emissions tool. So make it easy for the user, but find enough credibility to be actually useful. So we separated nutrient removal into a bacterial process, plant uptake, and sedimentation. And then all these together, you can, we're still building in some interlinkages. This is still work in progress, but the first working version is there, but we're not quite there yet. We've been developing this so far in another project, Better in the northeast of Friesland, and we'll be translating this to be applicable to a more international setting within Carbon Connects in the coming year. Another thing that we are doing within Carbon Connects is trying to estimate the water quantity effects of peat rewetting. Well, we're trying to apply, and our Irish partner Untitled is doing a lot of work on this. We're trying to estimate how much the water tables can rise and fall, and so preventing flooding and storing up water in the peat. And the interesting thing is that you can actually use bulk density to estimate a lot of hydrological parameters. So that's the trick that we're trying to use to keep this simple. That's it. That's what I've been trying to show you. Thank you all.
Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Laurent, and I am working as a geochemist at BRGM, the French Geological Survey. I am also involved as a partner in the Interreg Northwest Europe Carpet project. During this presentation, I will show you the modeling approach used in this project in order to simulate the greenhouse gas fluxes at the interface between peatland and atmosphere. During this presentation, I will first present you an overview, a very short overview of the Interreg Carpet project. Then I will present the methodology of the modeling approach, including the description of the numerical tool and a first application of it to a generic case. And at the end, I will finish my presentation by some conclusions and perspectives. Concerning the Interreg Carpet project, so the objectives of this project are first to develop, test and validate innovative restoration techniques by applying them to the different sites selected in this project. Actually, we have 5 sites where we will do some restorations. The second point concerns the measurement of carbon fluxes, mainly CO2 and methane, at the interface between peatland and atmosphere. The third point is the application of the restoration technique in order to transform peatland as carbon sinks instead of carbon sources, and to drastically reduce the greenhouse gas emissions on the long-term period. And in parallel, what we want to develop, it is a relevant numerical tool in order to predict some scenario and the future carbon fluxes in the peatlands. We have also some objective in terms of carbon reduction, and for example, by the end of the project, we want to reduce by 7,800 tons of CO2, of equivalent CO2 per year, the carbon emissions on the 5 pilot sites. We want also, after the end of the project in 2023, we want to continue to roll out the methodology and the techniques developed in the project to other regions, other countries, and other organizations in the Northwest Europe in order to continue to decrease the carbon emissions. Just for your information, you have here for the 5 sites project. So it is 1 site per country. So 1 in England, 1 in Ireland, in France, in Belgium, and in Netherlands. And as you can see, we are on different type of peatlands with vegetation types, with different also hydrogeological conditions. And the objective, it is to develop techniques devoted to this specificity of the sites. Concerning the modeling approach in the CARPIT project, so it is built in close collaboration with the partners who are involved in the field measurements. So of course they will apply for each site different methods and different tools in order to determine and to measure for example, the greenhouse gas fluxes. So they will use, for example, eddy covariance or flux chambers. And then they will provide this data to the modelers in order to calibrate the hydrogeochemical models. Then, after this step, we will develop a decision support tool. So this tool will be developed in collaboration with all the consortium, and the objective is to release this tool to the peatland managers. Concerning the numerical tool, so our objective, it is to represent the complexity of the ecosystem. What I mean here, it is that we want to be able to represent the chemical and the biochemical reactions inside the saturated, the unsaturated zone, but also to take into account the vegetation. So of course, as I said you, it is a very complex system because we have many interactions, of course, between the aqueous phase and the solid phase, but also in the unsaturated zone between the aqueous and the gaseous phase. We have also to take into account the evapotranspiration and the precipitation, and we need all this information to calculate the gas transfer at the interface between peatland and atmosphere. So of course, what we need here, it is to conceptualize all of this and to propose some scenario to model all these reactions and all these fluxes. And we have to consider all these interactions. You have here by these arrows the different interactions that we have to consider both in the saturated and in the unsaturated zone. And to do this, we propose to use the HPX program, which is developed recently. So just one word about this numerical tool. So it is a coupling between a flow transport model and a biogeochemistry model. So the flow transport model is able to simulate all the processes like advection and dispersion, but also other parameters like the growth of the roots, for example. And for the biogeochemistry, the code is able to simulate, for example, dissolution, precipitation, but also sorption, and also the microbiological mediated reactions. So you see that all these parameters are fundamental for the modeling of the peatland ecosystem. So this tool is quite recent and was recently developed, and it was never applied to a peatland ecosystem. This is the reason why we decided to apply it to a generic case. So you have just here the representation of this generic case. So we consider a generic porosity of 43%. We suppose, for example, in the saturated a reaction of CO2 production, but also of O2 consumption. So we just, in the first time, we just consider first order reactions, and we include the effect and the impact of some parameters like temperature and water. In this system, we consider also a variable recharge according to time. So you have here, for example, the effective recharge according to the time. So we make a simulation on 1 year. Yes, during 1 year, and we generated random climatic conditions. For the time being, we don't consider the vegetation, and we want to calculate the evolution and the variation of water, gas, and temperature inside the unsaturated zone. So just to show you some results about the application of this tool. So as I said we are able to follow, for example, the evolution. So each color corresponds to a different date. But what we see is that we are able to follow in the unsaturated zone the evolution of the water content. We can follow also the temperature, of course, according to the condition at the boundaries. We can also study the evolution of carbon, of CO2 in the system, and also the consumption of oxygen. And at the end, we are able to simulate the daily production of CO2 according to time. For example, we can see some important variation according to the recharge conditions. And for example, in a wet period, we have a decrease of the CO2 flux, whereas during the dry period, we have an increase of the CO2 production. So just to say that we are quite confident in this in this tool, and we think that we can now calculate the production of gases according to the given conditions. So just to conclude here, so we have now a numerical tool able to characterize the fluxes at the interface between us. Here. The next step now it is to use real data from the sites, for example, with temperature, with water level, and to compare the results with the measured CO2 emissions. And the next step will be to develop the decision support tool to the destination of managers and owners of peatlands. And the objective of this tool it is to simulate some scenarios on the mid and on the long term, and it is also to map the zones of the peatland with the zone of emissions and the zone of capture of CO2. So all of this will help in the management of the peatland. So I thank you very much for your attention, and of course, if you have questions, feel free to ask them. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hey everybody, thanks very much to the speakers for some 4 really interesting talks. Not too many questions in, but we've had a lot of discussion and dialogue in the chat where people have been really appreciative, I think, of how detailed some of the talks have been in terms of revealing the data behind the models and how the models work. I'm also looking forward to a new job on a peatland in the next few years. There looks to be plenty of employment maybe there, so that looks quite exciting. And also it's really good to hear about the stuff going on around the EU. One thing I'm sort of thinking about is this sort of topic came up, I think yesterday or a couple of days ago with Mark Reed how we sort of share data. And I know as academics, we're not necessarily very good at sharing our data and letting other people use our data, and particularly when it comes to sort of these different modelling approaches. And I'm sort of wondering what the different speakers think about, we've got, I guess, modelling going on in the UK. We've got our own emissions factors. We've got the GEST model. We've got Laurent's model. If we all come out with a different emissions factor for what could be quite similar types of peatland, do we risk sort of undermining confidence in these carbon offsetting schemes? And if we do, how do we sort of overcome that? I don't know if anybody fancies a quick stab at that, maybe. Christian, you I think your eyes met the screen.
Yes, indeed. First of all, yeah, all these models are an approximation of reality, and I think our task for the future, for the coming years, is to homogenize and to bring models together. By doing that, also acknowledge their geographical setting and probably also their setting in time. You should not forget that some of these models, they use data from the 80s and the 90s. And what we now see is that with temperature rise and with some of these ecosystems at the brink of drastic change when it comes to vegetation and stuff like that, we have to deal with new ecosystems, let's say, yeah, and so that would be my point. All these models tell a part of the truth, and if we can combine them smart, we get closer to the truth. But the truth is too expensive and too far away to wait for it.
Yeah, that's true. I think that point was made this morning. Actually, we've got to go with what we've got now to take action. And I guess, and something I remember probably when I was doing my PhD, that the phrase that all modelling is wrong, and which is true. But there again, all measurements are very variable too. We can go onto the same piece of land on 2 different days or different seasons and get entirely different results. So you actually raise another point, Christian, then, and maybe Jasper can think about this. How do we incorporate new data or apply it to apply the GEST model to new systems? As notably in the UK, there's a lot of peat bog types that aren't represented in GEST.
Yeah, no, indeed, it's not. But I think if you look at if you build up the infrastructure correctly, it's not that hard to add new data in there. At least not in the site emissions tool that we've been building, because it is fairly straightforward. I think it might be more difficult if you have a more complex model, but the approach we've taken was to try to make it as simple as we can get away with, without becoming fantastic liars or something. And I think we could rather easily incorporate new data. And yes, there is this issue of all these blanket bogs. They're not included in the GEST. So that's something that I actually we're trying to have a look at this to see how large these effects are or these differences are. Currently, I'm not quite sure how big the gap is. And then another thing, coming back to the previous question you raised, we need to realize that all the different models and measurements might come up with different numbers, and all the details may be different. But the large differences, we know the ballpark figures. Mm-hmm. So let's please use this to take action and not wait for all the decimals to be filled in.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate. Yeah, we know that a degraded peatland is bad for carbon and bad for ecosystem services, and we know that a healthy peatland is good. Just picking up one of the questions that came in from Andreas. In fact, there were a lot of questions from Andreas actually in the session about another guest one actually, and vegetation traits are a nice tool to link to greenhouse gas emissions with the satellites in brackets. However, this overlooks the important aspects of soil parameters, methane emissions, maybe water table and stuff. How do we sort of integrate those within GEST, and are they considered as well within the model? Anybody want to offer that one?
Well, I can. I think methane is actually in there, but of course there are error bars surrounding the average numbers, and that's where all the variation is in. I would assume. Yeah, maybe someone else has more details on the.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. Well, I would, from my own experience of, 15 years of greenhouse gas measurements, I have to say that vegetation is a good compromise, because it's also sensible to nutrients. It's sensible to redox, which doesn't mean that we could put even more detail in and add in systems that are prone to methane emissions. And here in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, we do quite some work on ebullition and stuff like that, to add additional dimension for either monitoring or forecasting emission reduction potential. And as Jasper also said, for some of these methane-prone sites, we have to even make GESTs. That's still in the beginning. I mean, there's just a few years of data now, so these sites, they don't have a GEST type yet. So I think it's a good point, and it can be solved.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess a lot of models can improve. I quite like the use of vegetation arts, because I can see an application for upscaling with remote sensing across landscapes quite effectively by mapping vegetation types. Can I ask a question to Laurent, actually, based on that as well? How possible is it? Your model's really heavy in sort of soil processes and water table effects. How well do you think that would upscale across a landscape, and what are the key parameters needed to be able to take your model to a big scale? Oh, you're muted, Laurent, sorry.
Concerning the main parameters, of course, the water table is of course of main importance, but Jasper said that also the porosity and the bulk density is of course a main parameter. We have also to include temperature and also the water content in the unsaturated zone. I think this is also a very important point to model the gas emissions. So this point also, if we can have a water content profile in the unsaturated zone, of course, it is of main importance. And then, of course, we will include other parameters like temperature, carbon content, and so on. But yes, the main one, it is and the first one to define it is, of course, the water saturation. In the saturated and many in the unsaturated zone.
Thanks, Laurent. And I'll just come to one more question on that we've had raised by the audience. Have we considered modelling in the long term, and by long term, I mean several thousand years, rather than over the shorter term? And the comment is, previous studies doing this on small scale projects have found somewhat weak or negative effects of rewetting after 200 years or so. I don't know if anybody can offer something to that. I guess gradually as a bog gets older and older, its actual net carbon uptake lowers, because the very slow decomposition processes that occur down below will gradually outweigh the stuff going in. But I don't know, can anyone have a comment about really long sort of stuff? I know there's been some stuff in the UK that have managed to model carbon stores. I think Ed Tipping did this going back from the last glaciation and managing to sort of fit it relatively well to now, but I haven't seen the sort of forecast going forward. Christian?
Well, yeah. There's actually two examples coming into my mind. One is that links directly to earlier talks, like in the Wiedenwerbe national park in the Netherlands, they need to actually cut off the newly formed peat because the entire surrounding is drained. So just to keep a more or less stable water level. So that gives you already an idea about it's about 1 centimeter per year on average they have to cut. And on the other hand, from the paleoecological studies that I'm aware of, which some of them are from the early 2010s, there you see if the regional water level just can move up and the temperature actually also increases a bit, then peatland accumulation rates increase. So the combination of stable hydrological condition and higher temperature, they're actually beneficial for carbon sequestration. So I'm not too much worried about the next 4,000 years as long as we keep the water keeping pace up with the peat accumulation rates. But if we don't do it, like in a bog, like Chris already explained, that increases and is too high at some stage and drains itself and things like that, then yeah, the long term might be different. But we know from studies in fens with groundwater recharge, they can keep on going for millennia.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And can I just apologise to Susanne because I haven't managed to ask you a question, and everyone else's session this week has seemed to run to time except the one I've done. So I'm really sorry. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. I just wanted to pick up on a comment that Clifton has made in the chat about the importance of keeping this dialogue going between the sort of the broad groups that are working on the different models, and within Europe as well at Greifswald with stuff that's going on in the UK. I think it's really important that we sort of manage to keep us all together and talking to try and help resolve problems together. But thanks very much to the speakers. It's been great, and thank you very much everybody who's joined us on this session.